OK, thank you. So let's move on. I did not write the book of DevOps, but I did write the song at DevOps Days Copenhagen. So if you want some very cringy singing, then go find that on YouTube. I teach Git. I've taught Git to hundreds of developers of all skill levels. And I maintain the Git katas, which is an open source set of exercises that you can just use. And please help us improve. So my story about repositories that we're going to talk about is that I had a day on site at a client, and the offices were not this nice, but this is me sitting at a computer. And then a manager dreadfully comes in and he says, building our software is too complex. And I was like, well, it's only Jenkins, some Gradle, Artifactory, and a few hundred Git repositories. This is easy. And I understand this is simple. And I was like, I became angry. Monolithic repositories suck. I don't care. Don't put your source code in one repository. And I literally got angry. And that's when I figured out I was being a bad consultant. Right? I was not helping anyone. It had become personal to me that I had some arbitrary hate, uninformed about monolithic repository structures. So I thought, we have to think about this. We have to learn. We have to figure out what's the right way for us to do stuff. So obviously, I go to the internet, and then recently I read this from Adam Jacob. Please do monolithic repository structures, which, of course, had please don't as a follow-up. So that did not make me any smarter, but that's generally the tone. And the Git community at large just doesn't care. Many things in Git. How should I do this in Git? Well, anything is possible in Git. Thank you. And and we also get things like, sorry, we did notice there was a problem because we were arguing about mono-repositories. It's hard to figure out. There's a lot of opinions on this topic. And then people always say, well, Google does it. Facebook does it. OK, we have 200 developers and perhaps 2 unfortunate people responsible for maintaining Bitbucket or GitHub Enterprise or whatever. We're not Google. So I would like to look a bit into how do we reason about anything, really. We like to do science. So there are some statins that's a drug, and we want to investigate whether that lowers the cholesterol of people, and that should lead to fewer heart attacks. Right? That's our hypothesis, and we can test that. They do double-blind studies and figure out, well, this works, so perhaps you should trust your doctor. In terms of software, this is probably the best research in software delivery performance we have currently. So if you're unaware of the State of DevOps report, please read it. How many here has read the State of DevOps report? It's always too few. So this is your homework. And then if you want to go more into the details of the science of how they figure out all these things, then you can read the awesome Accelerate book. But basically, this book is about we want to meet organizational goals, also known as make money in most cases. We have a theory that software delivery performance, as measured in these 5 metrics, deployment frequency, lead time, time to restore, change failure rate, and availability, we want to see that they drive business performance, or money, and what behaviors then drive software delivery performance. OK? So what we see, what they've found out, is basically continuous delivery drives software delivery performance, and software delivery performance drives organizational outcomes. OK? So that's quite cool. That means when you go to your boss and say, we need to work the right way, we need to do continuous delivery, and he says, why? Then you can just say, because we will earn more money. That is the current state of the science of these things. This is not double-blinded studies. It's not like you pick a company and they don't get to do TDD. But it's the best bet in these days. But what I want to talk a bit about is, what if the way that we think about repository structure negatively impacts our ability to deliver software efficiently? And how do we figure that out when people are just yelling on Twitter? So I'll just look a bit in at least some repository anti-patterns to say some places that we feel pain. And it could be the no Tooling Mono-repo, the monolithic repository that grew too big because it was a success, it was easy to work with. In this case, we get larger integration times because you have made perhaps a change in a small area of the code, and you need to test all the code, because what if something broke? We can see some performance. I unfortunately had to get Madonna up, so I missed most of the talk by the Google guys, but I for sure will check it when it's released. But they have such insane capabilities of scaling. Those capabilities are not present in the average company. We can get lockstep, keep pushing. Your push was rejected because it was not a fast-forward merge. But on the other hand, this is the extreme simplicity. So then we have the integration team, which is the biggest anti-pattern ever. You have full-time employees that does nothing but accept pull requests, if you have such advanced tooling. And you know there will be some boss, someone shows up in a suit and says, well, this needs to be fast-forwarded. We have priority boarding for this feature. So you break all the security gates you have. And then we have the distributed monolith, which is probably the most common scenario, because that's where things become very difficult, because it's about software architecture. And that's difficult. So generally, we can have a tightly coupled code base, and then we need to decompose that tightly coupled code base into a loosely coupled code base. And how do we do that? Well, we split the code up and put stuff in different repositories. Now we split stuff up, right? That's how you decompose a monolith. Excellent. But then we end up in a situation like this, which is a completely made-up software situation. And someone shows up in a suit and says, I want the web app to be able to do something. And then you need to make a commit in the web app, but you also touch the GUI repository. And you need to touch the math because of some way you calculate some CSS properties. So you also need to touch the utilities. And then you end up with 25 pull requests to close one ticket. That's not great. So this could hopefully be right. We don't have a friction between our repository layout and our software architecture. But we don't have that here either, right? So the boring conclusion is, I'm not going to tell you that you should do either monolithic repositories or the other that we don't have a good name for. But hopefully we'll talk a bit about how you can figure something out. So Google also published a study at the beginning of last year on their monolithic repository, where they surveyed a lot of developers, trying to figure out, is it a sane way to work? And this study is publicly available, so you can go read it. I'll just sum it very briefly up. Generally, people are very happy about working with software in the Google way. They generally see that it has an impact on velocity. The study does not say whether it's a positive or negative impact, but I'm assuming positive. They also see a huge, this is satisfaction with working with the monolithic code base compared to previous multi-repository code bases. So that's a huge improvement. And they actually also did some stat tracking by pulling out data of where people were touching code. So we have a nice tables of that, and see stuff like some small amount of developers only touch code in which they're not working on. Only code outside of their projects. So it's a qualitative study. I don't see anything wrong with that. But the key wins that this article concludes is that the availability of the entire code base is a strong win. The fact that you have complete visibility on the code base, not only that you can use it, but also that you can see it and browse it, see how APIs are used. But primarily, they see that the developer tooling around working this way is excellent. So those are the 3 key wins from working in the Google monolithic way, according to this survey. Then another of the fun companies, Netflix, also publish a lot of information. And they actually do a multi-repository setup, but kind of is trying to go to poly, or it's difficult to figure out what their plans are. But they posted this excellent blog post, and basically the conclusion is dependency management is hard. Which is true. In many cases, when we do monolithic repositories bad, it's because we forget to explicitly manage our dependencies. Dependency management is hard. Do you want code churn, or do you want overhead in managing complex situations? Uber has had a very great success in starting in a monolithic repository. Then, as they scaled to thousands of developers or grew, have scaled into multiple repositories using off-the-shelf products, commercially available products. And then they're talking about moving towards a more monolithic repository because now they are at a scale where they can invest heavily in developer tooling. We could also call this the Marie Kondo approach. If your repository layout does not bring you joy, thank it and change it. I don't know if the Uber method or the Kondo repository layout, that's the golden one. But this seems sane, right? This is organic, this is growing. But how do you know when and what to do? Excellent. How many here are aware of Conway's Law? Good, a good bunch. It's an ancient statement. It says any organization that produces systems are doomed to produce systems that has an architecture mirroring the ways the organization communicates. So this can be a good thing to say, we have to have the same way that our repositories should be supporting of the way that our software architecture is working, our organization should also be compatible with this. And this is why it doesn't work to say, we want to adopt the Spotify model. In the lean Toyota Kata environment, we have the go to Gemba, go and see. So we want to go investigate. So now we'll look at some concrete cases. I'm going to just show some anonymized visualizations of some work we did with a customer. And it's a customer that we moved from ClearCase to Git with tens of thousands of baselines into hundreds of repositories with a huge amount of C code. And perhaps a place where they have too many repositories, or different or bad or wrong repositories because it generates friction. So what are some of the things that we can look at to have informed discussions around scaling repositories rather than just me saying I hate monolithic repositories? So their platform, there was around 80 repositories for a lot fewer developers. So that might already be a warning flag. And how many repositories does it take? How many commits do we need to close one ticket? Because if anyone saw Pauline's talk yesterday, we want things to be atomic. So if we have to do more actions to do one thing, we're not working in an atomic way, and that's just an anti-pattern in itself. But this was quite easy to figure out because we have the information already. Because Git is awesome. And if you want to learn a new programming language and the Go was too mainstream, then I recommend Groovy, which is an excellent scripting language. Just go through all the repositories, also using the repo tool. That's also a nice tool for working with multiple repositories. Then we just pulled out tickets, Jira tickets from commit messages, because everything needs to be traceable. So in an enterprise world, of course, you reference your Jira ticket in a commit message. And the interesting part is these collisions. So we see something going towards, for instance, this. I promise you, the guitar is not their project key. But that might be a tooling task, this guitar, because we actually see that task in all of the repositories. And that at least is something that generates overhead. Right? If you have to do one task in the tooling team, you have to touch 80 repositories. That's bad. We also see things like bugs that you need to fix in multiple repositories, and also features that needs to touch multiple repositories to be completed. And this at least is something that does not look like a very loosely coupled architecture. So this is an extremely simple way of getting some place to start looking across repositories. These are candidates for stuff you could mash together. Of course, you shouldn't do it naively, because I say you can script your way out of this, and then you can mash them together. But this might be a good starting point for the discussion, also around how do we work with our tooling. So they created a new platform. They had figured out that 80 repositories, that were too many, so we will only use one. Right? That's the only alternatives. Too many or one. Because it's easier. And as we've seen many places, also Martin Fowler talks about that, it's a very good place to start. So now we add a bit more tools to our kit. There's an excellent book called Your Code as a Crime Scene by Adam Thornhill that I recommend you read. Allows you to get a nice perspective on your code base and how it evolves over time. He made an open source tool called MART or Mode. That also helps with some of this analysis. We're still using Git and Groovy because awesome tools. And then we've added D3.js to the mix to get a visualization. So one of the things that we looked at was in this monolithic platform, what does it look like when we look at it from a team perspective? So we want to be people-focused, so it fits with our Conway's law. And remember, this is one team. This is one team working on one repository. And it might be a bit hard to see what's going on here. But the circles are generally, the larger circles are folders, and each colored dot is a developer. So a developer has a color, and the size of the dot, that says something about how many commits are there in that area by that developer. And this is fun because this is one team, but we actually can see some implicit team structure from this. We can see that we have someone here that does a lot of work here and over here. These are not proper class names. They're from the enterprise class name generator for purposes of anonymity. And we also see that even though we have the separate places, this green person is doing a bunch of work here. We might also have an issue if we lose the red person, right? The red person is touching really many things. So we might have a bus factor issue here. So let's try to dive down a bit deeper. So this is just half of the figure that we looked at before. And we see something like, we have a sub-team here. We also kind of have a sub-team with this bright green guy and the pink guy. And perhaps something in here in advisor meta that we can pull out. And we actually also see a lot of collaboration between the red ubiquitous guy and this one here. So there are, even though that we have one team in theory, we have one team working on one product, we have a lot of implicit teams here. So if we want to go the agile way and have self-contained teams that are able to release independently, this could be a guide to where there might be made reasonably cuts. Again, freely available tools. So this is going and see. The issue that we found was the friction that was too low to change. So it isn't painful enough yet for them with this, which should make me happy, but I'm still a bit of a hater on monolithic repositories, so it was very dissatisfying that we couldn't follow through with this. One of the ways to find out if you're having too much pain, or that might be a bad phrasing, if you're not experiencing enough joy while developing, is looking at the 5 metrics that we had from the State of DevOps report. The good thing about these 5 metrics is that if you try to maximize all of them simultaneously, they're very, very hard to game. They're very hard to do local optimizations on that will sub-optimize the entire process. And some of my colleagues actually, not accidentally, I assume they did it very much on purpose. But while I was looking at this for another customer, they looked at how can we, in a pure Git fashion, get these metrics out of your repositories. So that could be a way to figure out when is a good time to do some split. Do we see increase in friction? Do we see that we have a lower software delivery performance? Because, again, these metrics are what drives organizational goals. And this is freely available on GitHub. So grab it and use it. Then I also tried to do the cool visualization on the git.git source code, because I thought, well, then I can stand here and say, well, you should split the Git repository this way, and people would be really mad at me. Unfortunately, I didn't really find anything that was very interesting. So it seems like it's a sane enough way to do it. At least I did not have enough domain knowledge on the Git code base. But I just want to say that Eva, he rocks, because over the last year, he's the one who has removed most code from the Git code base. So if we could give Eva a hand for that. It's easy to add code. It's very hard to remove code. So rounding off, you don't need fancy tools. We have Git, right? So you already have the tools to do all the things that I've just showed you. Our conclusions are not better than our data. And this seems like obvious, but people just forget that all the time. So again, make atomic commits. Pauline will probably love to discuss that with you. And make sure that you put good data in wherever you're working. So make good commit messages. Make sure that you have the traceability and the data that you need for the conclusions that you're going to make. And then a very important point. It is extremely easy to discuss, should we have a monolithic repository structure? Should we have a polylithic? We can have a discussion about what we call it. Or should we have that many repositories? Or it's easy to discuss, should we merge or should we rebase? Should we use GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket for our codes? Should we use Azure? Those are easy discussions. But in many cases, they're not the important discussions. The important discussions are, how is our workflow moving on? Do we have a completely dysfunctional way to have meetings? Are we doing Scrum like very, very badly? So the ending advice, and that's boring, about repository structures, it's probably not your biggest problem. So don't allow this to distract you from the real problems. Thank you. Go and see.